talk about Neo-Fischerianism, which I can barely pronounce. This is a topic that has been more in the blogosphere, I think, than in academic papers, but there's a lot, as you'll see, there's a lot of people talking about it, and so I thought I'd use this opportunity. Also connects a lot to the learned literature, so I thought I'd use this opportunity to regale you about this. This is the introduction slide. There's not a lot out there. The direct links between this topic and current monetary policy are kind of limited, but I think it might be an important part of monetary policy, sort of medium term, long term, depending on how you view the data that I'm going to show you here. So I think you should think about my comments in that vein, and not really talking about, especially current monetary policy right now. So here's the background. The Fisher equation, very important. It's in all our models. If you look at, and I know a lot of you have, if you look at what Benavides, Macroeconomic, and Uribe had to say in their Taylor rules paper, they combined the Fisher equation with a Taylor-type policy rule and zero lower bound. They argued that if you looked from a global perspective, that you would get an unintended steady state, some of which we heard about today, that's characterized by near zero short-term nominal interest rates and lower negative inflation. I argued in a paper that an unmitigated ZIRP policy may cause convergence to this unintended steady state. I put unmitigated into italics here because if you think about what's happened during the crisis, it hasn't just been ZIRP, which is zero interest rate policy. It hasn't just been observed because the Fed is also, and other central banks have also done a lot of other things. And so one of the themes here will be how should we think about those other things? An unmitigated ZIRP policy would just be committing to zero rates, and that's the only thing, the only reaction to the crisis. So I'll talk about that. The learning literature says the opposite, so you guys were no help here. Said the opposite of what I was trying to say. He said, no way, this thing is not, roughly speaking, is now a stable, steady state equilibrium, and therefore you don't probably need to worry about the low steady state. So I'm going to talk all about this. This is just a background slide. So the idea that the Fisher equation could dictate convergence dynamic has since been labeled in the blogosphere as Neo-Fischerian. So the core idea would be that if you maintain and commit to the ZIRP policy for a sufficiently long period of time, instead of getting higher inflation, you would actually get low inflation and low nominal interest rates, and that would just become a permanent situation. So if you look at the Garcia, Smith, and Woodford vapor paper, which is circulating around over the last couple of months, they've been giving it at conferences, but it's in slide form only right now. But if you look at it, they do verify that this could happen under rational expectations in the standard Keynesian model. So support for the basic idea, although they argue in different directions. Many of you know that John Cochran, on his blog and in some earlier papers, has talked about this and raised questions about this. So in this talk, here's how we're going to go. First of all, Japan has been the poster child for the low nominal interest rate, low inflation equilibrium. And I'm just going to call that the LL steady state, low nominal interest rates, low inflation. I'm not going to say too much about welfare, so if you want to, my staff always brings up welfare, so we can talk about that later. But I'll just call it the LL steady state. And that's actually what motivated Benavides, Macroeconomic, and Uribe. I'm going to just talk informally about the state of more recent empirical evidence for convergence to the LL steady state across key developed economies. So what this talk is basically going to be is just a bunch of pictures. And I'll talk about these pictures. And the bottom line is that the evidence is arguably pointing to some kind of convergence or basin of attraction, possibly, or depending on how you want to interpret the data for LL convergence. So you guys in the macro learning literature are at odds with this prediction or this data, and so that's just kind of the punchline. Get busy. Start putting together models that are more consistent with the data. So let's just talk for a second. I know a lot of you know this model, some of you don't. About what NBL said. So in their paper, policymakers absolutely control short-term nominal interest rate. That's their only policy lever. That's the only way they act, is to control short-term interest rate. They are rigidly committed to a Taylor-type rule with inflation as a single argument, and they will deviate from this Taylor rule under no circumstances. Total commitment. So one thing about that bullet point that you should think about is, well, how does that mesh with all the other kinds of unconventional policy that has since occurred, especially quantitative easing, and how should we think about that? So I'll weave that into my talk here. And then this policy rule obeys the Taylor principle in that the policy rate responds more than 1-for-1 deviations of inflation from target that should say near the targeted steady state. And then the zero-bound ZOB constraint policy from below, you put those three ingredients together and you get this LL steady state. So that's the basic BSD framework. One thing that's impressive about this argument, and one reason I've championed it, is that these elements exist in a lot of different models with a lot of different assumptions. You could have these three. These are such basic building blocks of macroeconomic model, monetary policy, that you can probably see these in lots of different places. So here's a picture of what they were talking about. On the horizontal axis would be inflation. On the vertical axis would be the nominal interest rate. The red dotted line is the Fisher relation. The black line is the nonlinear Taylor type rule, which is constrained by the zero bound as you go to the left in the diagram. Where the two lines cross on the right-hand side of the graph is called the targeted steady state. The two lines cross again on the left-hand part of the graph, and that's called I'm going to call it, it's called the LL steady state, or the unintended steady state. In this picture, I put the U.S. data on here. That's the boxes on the right-hand part of this picture, so you could kind of think about those boxes as fitting this kind of model. And then the circles, the green circles, are the Japanese data, and they've been clustered around this other long-run outcome. So, by the way, this has been updated to the most current data, and if you look carefully at the zero axis there, you can see some green circles over there with higher inflation. So we'll talk about that as we go through the talk here. But somehow, basically, the U.S. could be described as being at the targeted steady state, or orbiting around the targeted steady state, and the Japanese are stuck in the LL steady state. So this is the basic idea. So the question is, how relevant is this LL steady state? Most people want to make excuses for the Japanese situation from 1995, at least up until the crisis, and ignore this picture. They would ignore this picture, and they would say there's something special about Japan, and that the other countries will never get stuck in this steady state. Financial markets, on the other hand, tend to put high weight on the probability of convergence to the LL steady state. Just the other day when I was writing up these slides, a survey at a recent gathering of Wall Street guys said that 78% or more are worried about deflation than inflation. You can interpret that they think you can go down and up. The learning literature, you guys and policymakers tend to put low or zero weight on convergence to the LL steady state, because in traditional analysis, with most analysis of learning, you would say that the low steady state is unstable in the learning dynamics, and therefore learning dynamics are going to push you back toward the targeted steady state. So this is sort of a victory for the learning literature in a way, because here's a case where learning is very important. It's an equilibrium selection story, and it has a clear prediction, at least in basic versions, and everyone has bought into it. All the policymakers have said, yeah, we love that argument, and we're going to pick up that argument. So chalk that one up to victory. You know, the problem is the data is not cooperating. So here's some samples from the academic literature, and I'm not trying to do a comprehensive survey here, but I just want to pick out a few papers that I've been struck by in the last few years. So this is Eugene paper. So beautiful continuous time analysis of the dynamics of the Keynesian model. There is no LL steady state in this model. And I've actually written to him and talked to him about this. He didn't know what I was talking about. So what bugged me about it, though, is not so much that he didn't have the other steady state, it's that he didn't have the other steady state, and he was talking about a case where R equals 0. So you've got one of your variables is right on top of the value that would be consistent with that steady state. And then he's telling me all this stuff about the dynamics and stuff. So that paper was influential. It's supposed to have turned, according to legend, it has turned Mariana Coach-Lakota to the dovish side on the FOMC. So it's kind of stuff dramatic, I think. So this Garcia, Schmidt, and Woodford set of slides. They have the LL steady state of the Keynesian model. They think it's a curiosity, and they think any reasonable departure from rational expectations suggests that it's not a relevant medium-term outcome. You can check out their slides online. George Evans has a paper with an alternative Keynesian model that has a low LL equilibrium. It's a locally stable stagnation regime, so that you can modify the model. Many of you have done it, where you get 3 steady states, and the third one is actually stable under learning. And then you can talk about a Japanese getting stuck there, and U.S. say being at a high steady state or something like that. So I think that's very interesting, and that's probably most consistent with what I'm trying to say here. And then you can talk about policies that would knock you out of that basic attraction and knock you out of the target steady state. Schmidt, Uribe have in some ways the most radical paper in which you have to raise the policy rate in order to raise inflation. So that's the more radical version of what this means. Now, what my staff tells me is, well, why do we have to stick with the new Keynesian model? We could have departures from that and then make the data better. Maybe you just get stuck in this model that has the 2 steady states and the learning going to the 1 steady state. So if you look at Aberfado and Williamson, it's a rational expectations paper, but they do allow for liquidity premium on bonds. Bonds have transactions, value transactions. They also allow for asset shortages. They get an LL equilibrium that can be persistent. Same thing with caviar and Fari. Shortage of safe assets. So the whole shortage of safe assets idea as to why bond prices are high and yields are low makes a lot of sense in many ways, and they're trying to formalize that. Egerton and Marotra have a secular stagnation story. So, you know, there is this issue, and that's why I'm not talking too much about welfare. There's this issue about, you know, are we just talking about low nominal interest rates and low inflation, or also low output and low consumption and low welfare? And for Egerton and Marotra, they definitely want to talk about the low level equilibrium associated with bad welfare. All right, so part of this is just let's just look at the data. How about that? And see what the data says. Put through all this theory. So let's consider a schematic representation of the 2 BSC steady states. We'll just assume an inflation target of 2%. We'll assume a short-term steady state real interest rate of 1% for all countries. So it's just, you know, totally schematic. 1% might be reasonable. Let's use headline inflation measured from 1 year earlier. We'll use OECD data so that everything's consistent across countries. Now in these charts, the policy rate is going to be on the left axis, inflation will be on the right axis, and they'll be offset by 1% because that's the real interest rate. Okay. So if you start with Japan, they've spent a lot of time near the LL steady state. They did not have an inflation target until recently. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. You've got Abenomics coming on in the fall of 2012. Hirohiko Kuroda was named to the head of the BOJ in spring of 2013. So this QQE program has arguably had an important impact in maybe moving inflation closer to the 2% target. So here's Japan. Again, this dotted line across the top there is the high steady state. The dotted line at 0 nominal interest rates and minus 1% inflation. on the right-hand scale is the low steady state. This picture goes all the way back to 1992. So coming out of the 80s, Japan had high nominal interest rates and inflation. They went down and spent about 2 decades close to the low steady state. Nominal interest rates in particular have not been above 0.5% since January 1995. That's been a long time. You can see on the right-hand part of this chart that inflation has moved up in Japan. Maybe that's due to the quantitative easing program. You can argue about that. Or some people say it's temporary. All of these pictures will have a vertical line at Lehman AIG, which is September 2008, which for most countries is the time when nominal interest rates went to zero, but not for Japan. For the USA, we've had inflation above target as of January 2012, but inflation has since declined. You have to keep in mind also that the Fed has pursued unconventional monetary policies, most notably QE2 in 2010, which we heard about some today, and again beginning in 2012 with an open-ended QE program that lasted longer than expected. Into 2014, those programs have left the Fed with a $4.5 trillion balance sheet. So in this picture, this goes back to January of 2002. I like this because on the left-hand side, you can kind of think about that as being the sort of the normal behavior around the targeted steady state. You can see the crisis in the middle. Inflation falls a lot. And inflation rebounded. It hasn't been too bad really until recently, but now we're down at zero inflation and zero nominal interest rates off the left-hand scale. So certainly looks like a little bit grim for the U.S. here, but now I'm going to have something to say about this because some of this is driving, oil prices are driving some of this. So here's the euro area. For them, inflation was also above target in 2012, but it's declined. The ECB, what's different about them is that they generally resisted any kind of unconventional monetary policy for 5 years. A lot of that makes sense. It's a multinational organization. They did not want to buy bonds across countries. But inflation was far below target, and in 2015, the ECB undertook a large QE program, which is expected to continue until September of next year. So the main development in the global economy from a kind of current development perspective in the last 2 years is that the euro area is starting to look a lot like Japan. So here's a picture for the euro area. In a lot of ways, this is a lot better than the U.S. picture from the point of view of my story. At the left-hand part of this chart, you certainly got inflation and nominal interest rates close to the kind of normal or targeted steady state. You have the crisis, inflation rebounds after the crisis, but policy rate remains very low, and now you're at zero inflation and zero nominal interest rates in the euro area. The other thing about the euro area is that one way to interpret quantitative easing is that it doesn't really have any direct effects, as a lot of you don't recognize, but that it signals that you're going to stay at zero even longer. So for the kind of thing I'm talking about, you'd be not only at zero for 6.5 years, but then you'd be promising through the QE program to continue to be at zero at least for another couple of years. And that would be enough to get the dynamics pulling toward the low nominal interest rate, low inflation outcome. So, and keep in mind, standard Keynesian theory is saying, if you're going to have nominal interest rates at zero for 6.5 years, that's supposed to generate a consumption boom. That's supposed to generate higher inflation. Inflation should be up above targets, and instead it's going the other way. UK is thought to be less affected by Neo-Fischerian concerns. Inflation's been above target since 2008, so those that think that high inflation was the answer to our problems should look to the UK. The UK actually, after the crisis, as you can see, nominal interest rates fell. They kept inflation above target for 4 or 5 years. But I think as far as the real economy goes, they probably get any better outcomes than other countries. So I'm not sure that the secret to success is really whether inflation was 1% of Sarah or 3 or 4% of Sarah. But in any event, inflation inflation has subsequently fallen since 2012, and now it runs around 0. And of course, the policy rate is still near 0, though the UK is thinking about lifting up. Let's look at some smaller open economies. The Riksbank raised rates to combat rising inflation during 2011-2012, but inflation then fell considerably below target, and they're now at a low inflation, low nominal interest rate steady state, or close to one. So here's the Swedish picture. The thing about Sweden is that they had a housing, or perceived housing bubble anyway, in 2011 and 2012, so they did raise rates, as you can see here in the chart, but they were forced to retreat back to the zero interest rate policy, and in recent years, they have quarters, I guess, they have experimented with negative rates, so eventually you can see the dotted red line go actually below 0 there. Inflation is stabilized around 0. And finally, here's Switzerland. They've arguably been almost as close to the LL steady state as Japan over the last decade. Swiss inflation has been 0 negative for 3.5 years. They've also experimented with negative policy rates. So here's the same picture for Switzerland. If you look on the right-hand part of this chart, inflation is -1, and nominal interest rates are now about -1 in Switzerland. So now the Swiss economy has never really been all that close to the targeted steady state by this kind of analysis. So what do we learn from this? Policy rates in these countries have been near 0 for most or all of the last 6.5 years. Conventional New Keynesian theory says that inflation should have materialized, and certainly on a time scale that's much shorter than 6.5 years. The kinds of dynamics that we're talking about are supposed to, be on the order of quarters and business cycles. Empires are supposed to have risen and fallen in the time that's taken things to happen here. So the time scales are way off from what our typical models would say, or our typical business cycle analysis would say. So let's assess whether these countries are closer today to the targeted steady state or the LL steady state, and we'll use the Euclidean distance in the policy rate and the inflation rate. If you get this table, this is just based on the June data. This is how far in the Euclidean distance these countries would be from the high steady state or from the low steady state. And you can see the low steady state column wins. All these numbers are smaller. And so if you had to guess, you'd say they're closer to the low steady state. Why should that be after 6.5 years of 0 policy rates? That's kind of the main question. I'm sure you could dream up a far more sophisticated empirical analysis here and try to discriminate which steady state is more likely or put probabilities on it, but I think you get kind of the same message that you're getting in this kind of simple table here. So, of course, some of this is because policy rates are still at 0, so you're doing Euclidean distance, and one of the variables is the policy rate is close to 0, so that's one thing. You could interpret that quantitative easing programs in Japan and Europe as indicating further commitment to the 0 policy rate for some time in the future. The Neo-Fischerian idea would be that, in fact, that's going to drag down inflation expectations and inflation, because the only thing if you're going to stay at 0 forever, the only thing consistent with staying at 0 forever in the Fisher equation is that inflation would fall to a low negative. So this commitment might be long enough to strengthen the Neo-Fischerian dynamics. Okay. So there are some further considerations and caveats, and these do influence my thinking on policy. So I'm actually going to come down on the other side of this, but I'll see what you think about it. So you can make the case that the LL steady state has a basis of retraction in an empirical sense. This conflicts with the general result of the learning literature that the LL steady state is local and stable. There are many other possibilities. You can change the model, as some of these authors have done. And global factors might be important. One of them is the oil price shock, which has affected inflation. So one argument would be that we're all set to return to normal in 2014, but we got a 50% reduction in the price of oil, which is a huge shock in this space, and this just shows West Texas Intermediate Brent. Since stabilized in recent days, now it's been coming down even further. A lot of people think this is supply driven. You've got fracking in the US, you've got Iran, you've got a lot of things going on. So they kind of think of this as an exogenous thing. So maybe that's just temporarily affecting global inflation rates, and I have in fact argued that in interviews. If you look at something like the Dallas Fed trim mean or the Atlanta Fed's sticky price CPI inflation, you get a picture that looks like this. This is the inflation rate dating from January 2010 to the present, and it's not too far from 2% if you want to look at that. So that would be a way to maybe clean out some of the oil price effect. So if you're looking at this picture, and I do put a lot of weight on this picture, then you wouldn't worry about it. One thing about this picture is that this goes back to 2010. So when I wrote the Carroll's paper, if you had looked at these kinds of measures of inflation, you would have been looking at this dip over here, where inflation was below 1%. So that's what got me concerned. Inflation expectations were also low at that point, and I thought we were probably headed toward a much lower kind of nominal steady state than we intended, and maybe we should do something about that. But if you look on the right-hand part of that chart, this chart, that isn't happening now. So that gives you some confidence that what's going on with inflation is temporary. What about inflation expectations, which should of course be critical? Neo-Fischerian story would require that inflation expectations are also falling as the ZIRP policy continues. So you just stick with the ZIRP policy forever and ever and ever, and eventually the private sector gives up, and then just the inflation expectations fall. So one way to evaluate that is Chair Yellen and many members of the committee, including me, have put heavy weight on the idea that actual inflation expectations are well anchored. You can look at the TIPS-based measures of inflation expectations. We're going to look at 10-year expected inflation. For most of these countries, it's below 2%. The exception is the UK. So here's TIPS-based inflation over the next 10 years. 10 years. In some sense, this should never deviate from 2% if the central banks are really pretty credible. You should be able to hit your inflation target over 10 years. The high line there is the UK, so they have relatively high inflation expectations by this measure. The next highest is the US, so the US is maybe reasonably close. The low three ones there are Japan, Sweden, and Germany, all of which are below 1.5%, close to 1%. So, depending on if you want to look at it from the US perspective or the European perspective or the Japanese perspective, inflation expectations could be argued to be well anchored, at least for the US. Also, the Neo-Fischerian story, this is almost done here, so if you have any questions, if you haven't fallen into the phone, you might want to think about what they are. But the Neo-Fischerian story would also say that you should see bond yields compressing and coming down to a very low level as you stick with the ZIRP policy for a long time, and as inflation and inflation risk premium maybe are all falling. So that might actually be happening. Here's a 10-year bond yield across the 6 countries that we're looking at here since over the last decade. So you can see in the earlier part of the 10-year period, you have more normal dynamics except for Japan, which is the lowest line in this picture. And now as you get over to the right-hand part of this chart, the latest bond yields in the U.S. are just a little bit over 2%. 10-year bond yield, just a little over 2%, just shocking how low they are. And then these very low bond yields, Japan isn't even the lowest anymore. You've got Switzerland lower, Germany lower, and it's like Sweden and sure, I got the whole picture here. And I guess the UK is about the same as the US. So all of those are below 1% on a 10-year yield. And some have been negative in recent months. So this would argue that this is something you should see if the Fischerian dynamics are sort of causing have some attractiveness for the energy steady state. All right, so let's finish. Policymaker conventional wisdom and new Keynesian theory say low nominal interest rates cause inflation to rise. Simple empirical evidence here suggests that this is not happening even after 6.5 years of the ZIRP policy. There are still reasons for maintaining faith in the conventional wisdom. You got this major oil price shock. You've got anchored inflation expectations. I didn't mention you've got very good labor markets in the U.S. Maybe the Phillips curve will resurrect and push inflation up through that channel. It's certainly something many observers expect. The general result from the learning literature, and I know I'm sort of overstating this, but that the local instability of the LL steady state seems to be unhelpful because it's predicting a natural return of inflation and nominal interest rates when the data seems to be going in the opposite direction. Even if the Fed begins normalization this year, as 15 out of 17 members of the committee say that it will, the U.S. and other rates will still be really, really low over the medium term. So you're talking about going up 25 basis points. You're talking about going up very slowly. So you're going to have low rates. I don't think it's really a question about lift-off. It's more a question about what are the medium-term dynamics. It's possible that these very low rates are pulling inflation expectations lower. I'm willing to argue for now that current inflation is low in part due to temporary factors and that inflation expectations remain well anchored. But if this effect is strong in the years ahead, we'll need to think about monetary policy and alternatives. So that's my story. Here's the references. So I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Yes, Stephen is usually going to take a few questions. Can I start?
You can.
Yeah, I have three quick comments. First, from a rational expectations point of view with the two steady states, which you have the multiplicity problem that Timothy Schmidt really emphasized. What stands out is that the levels of output in the two steady states are not that big. And our concern is not now just purely low inflation or deflation. It's the low levels of output. So that's what we were worried about in the United States. We're less worried about now. We're certainly worried about it in Europe. So that suggests that the rational expectations view of inflation is missing something.
So if you could have rational expectations, you could still have low steady state be fast.
But it's not. It's in the moment. Okay. So how do you get to that steady state? Well, first you recognize that under adaptive learning, the low steady state is unstable. The high steady state is stable. That doesn't mean you go to the high steady state. The low steady state is unstable and has nearby divergent trajectories to make it lower output and lower inflation. Okay, so what's the problem from a learning point of view? Is that it's suggestive. It suggests that inflation is going to fall and fall, output is going to fall and fall. It gets the low level of output right, but not the continually falling output and continually falling inflation. So that's why I suggest we repair the model and say, well, we always knew something odd was happening in the Great Depression. There was a lot of inflation, and then it kind of stabilized. And there are a lot of studies as well. So the empirical evidence on the Phillips curve for high unemployment rates has always been kind of puzzling. There never seems to be as much inflation as you expect. So if you change the model and just say, well, there's a lower level to the deflation rate, which is somehow the maximum amount that people are willing to tolerate. For some reason, there's some sort of downward stickiness on the lower side that puts an underpinning to the deflation rate. And if you then add to that a consumption lower bound, you wind up with three steady states. Two locally stable, one good and another one bad, and that in between one, not so bad, but locally unstable. So, of course, this may not be the right story, but
no, I think
it should sort all the facts.
I think my message is I think you should be exploring models exactly like that, and you should be. But that isn't the state of affairs in the policy world. The state of affairs in the policy world is, yes, we read that in the paper, But we decided that that steady state was irrelevant, so we're going to ignore the whole issue, and we're going to assume that zero is going to send us back to, all we have to do is stay at zero long enough to go back. And that's not enough technology.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. What about Mordecai?
We went down to the zero now for 4 weeks. In my opinion, we went down there because we faced a major deleveraging problem. I'm not the only one who said that. Now, the statistic shows that we have another $2 trillion of deleveraging to go. We are well unfinished with the deleveraging factor. So if you take a model 9%, there is still a factor affecting output lower. And nothing to do with zero low output with the steady state. It is the fact that there is a pressure on demand as a result of the deleveraging process. And we will stay there as long as the deleveraging will continue, or else find a policy to get the deleveraging done.
I'm all for it. I mean,
But wait, your words make sense with deleveraging and any results. That's my question.
the standard models that we work with don't have any data at all. So I'll see if I can.
I presented one that had.
No, I know. So I think, again, I guess that's the kind of thing we should be doing. I'm happy from the policy perspective here, where we're saying, oh, you know, we looked at the standard deviation model. It tells us debt isn't important. It tells us that the steady state is unstable, and these are the things that are being taken as a lesson for policy. I'm saying you should use what you're talking about.
In my model, there's a unique steady state. It is endogenous steady state. They are the two fictitious steady states are irrelevant.
I wouldn't say they're irrelevant.
Well, they're there. Okay, but the economy is wondering something else.
Bruce Preston next.
So I guess, I mean, we could turn the argument around, we spoke about this yesterday, and it seems like you're arguing that we should normalize normal interest rates to the standard steady state, follow the spring rate and its recent highs, and that will raise inflation expectations, and affects general terms. So I'm curious as to why you think that's a bad idea, or if you don't think it's a bad idea, why you can't be more confident.
So I think when I talk about this, I always emphasize going down. So when you have the big bad shock, and then you get stuck at the zero bound, and then you stay at the zero bound program on that, it's interest rate pay. And then you promise to stay at zero even longer. So this is what sets up the expectations that might be pulling the economy toward that steady state. When you go up, there's nothing similar, because it isn't like we say, okay, now tomorrow interest rates are going to be 4%, and we're going to stay there for a decade, and this is going to pull the economy toward that. So I think what will happen is if we get off the zero bound, it'll be because we can argue that the economy is doing better, we get good news on the economy, gradually raise the minimum interest rate, inflation expectations rise, and this will be a virtuous cycle that if that works.
First,
It is.
yeah.
So it is a big story. Go ahead.
So if you're really worried about this sort of inflationary steady state, I think there's a pretty simple solution, and I think it's somewhere in one of the Schlichter papers too. I think that has nothing, the solution is not monetary policy. You just, as a fiscal policy maker, make sure that the amount of nominal claims that is outstanding and that's held by the private sector isn't shrinking. And so that as you have deflation, the real value of that thing keeps exploding. And that will eliminate that steady state altogether. So there's a very simple solution to make, to create a lot of nominal claims in the private sector. That would make the Kansas County spend violate devaluated if that state purpose. And I think it's a very reasonable mechanism because it says, the value of the private sector in inflation would explode and people would start spending.
Right, so the government has to commit to do something that's not consistent with equilibrium, and then therefore this changes the private sector expectations. So I think Chari and others have called that, what they call it, not credible implementation or something like that. So you're threatening to jump up and down and throw a tantrum because private sector expectations aren't what you think they should be. And therefore, because you're threatening to do that, that makes the private sector expectations turn around. I don't think that works. But, and anyway, fiscal policy doesn't upside down. You have to take fiscal policy as given.
No?
So how much of this do you think is driven by movements of railways?
Yeah, so that's been a hot topic, and I'm not really talking, I'm skirting past that in the stocks. So what a lot of people are saying, so the reason everything's low is because real rates are low, and they look like they're going to be low for a long time. You can still very slow growth for a long time. And of course, a lot of good arguments being made about that. What's a little disturbing to me about that is that there was 100 years of evidence, or maybe 150 or 120 years of evidence that the U.S. was basically on the same log GDP path through 2 world wars and the economy changing from 50% agriculture to 2% agriculture and everything else that happened over that period. And technology just seemed to drive that same path. Now, to say all of a sudden something's happened and we're off that path, it's a dramatic statement. But it could be true. Or it could be something about the crisis damaged the economy in some important way. And, it's just a bit slow growth. But I wouldn't see monetary policy as having a lot that we have to do about that, if that's what's really going on.
So, getting back to this idea of fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy as a way to get away from this liquidity trap. I mean, that was in the original Benedict Schmidt-Grow rebate paper. That was what their solution was, to get away from the lower steady state. And Klaus mentioned this too, but right now in the United States, we have already done that. We have the the unfunded liabilities for Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, on the order of like 600% of GDP. So why isn't the private sector taking that into account? But the only way to pay for these unfunded liabilities is through inflation. So, I mean, that's a theory, it's supposed to work, but it doesn't seem to
Another
work.
way to say that is if you want to run up a lot of debt, go talk to the Japanese. They've got, even the official debt to GDP number is 250%.
Yeah, exactly.
And that doesn't seem to be enough to drive expectations. So that's why I say I don't think this kind of thing is going to work. Or another way to think about it is you have to push that so hard that you might get into some kind of really dangerous situation that will blow up.
Other questions? Yep.
So to speak to the baseline, basically, within the model, like the recipe for jumpstarting the economy, it's basically not much along the state of the economy. In fact, the problem is saying when the economy recovers, so you have more inflation and so on and so forth. And from the European perspective, one could take to some of the experience that we've seen in other countries that the economies were too ready to lift off from zero line. In fact, they have to go back down to zero line. So more generally, there might be like a perception that central banks are not really serious in delivering response after the crisis ends. This legal expectation of whatever the recipe is inside the economy. So I was just wondering what you do, and would you read some of the failures or say this convergence to this low inflation as part of that or something else?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this is the Swedish case here. So inflation started to go up and went above target. They naturally started to raise rates. I think that was probably the right response. Then they got hit by a shock that pushed them back down. That's what I think what the Swedes would say. I don't know. The shock, by the time they got to 2011, 2012, the was in the middle of the Saudi debt crisis, so it's probably so, what I think you should do on this issue about, you should raise rates when you think you should raise rates. Follow the best policy that you can, and if shocks come along and push you back into a reconsideration. That's the way it goes. So I wouldn't try to overcompensate for that. You want to try to pursue the best policy.
So I have two questions. One relating to Noah. So you talked about GDP being the same log growth rate for years, and I just thought the one thing that probably the first time in human history we're going to have a plurality of people over 50 or over 60 in most developed countries. So maybe that's something. And what your thoughts are on the demographic changes, especially with Japan. And the second question would be: do you think even with starting to lift up rates, are we doomed to just be back to zero lower bound in the next recession that happens in 3 or 4 years?
I'm sorry, what's the
So are we doomed to be back to the zero lower bound in the next 3 or 4 years because there'll be another recession, even if we do achieve a temporary period of lift up?
Let me take the second question first. So that this duration is starting to get way out of line with everything that we talk about in our business cycle dynamics and our impulse response functions and stuff. So, a very plausible scenario is that even if we do lift off or when we do lift off, rates will still be very low. And then something big shock will happen. We'll go back into recession and we'll go back to zero. So it's very plausible. So, and you've even got people saying, well, you should be prepared for that, so that's why you should get off the zero. Well, I don't actually subscribe to that. But you could read the Japanese data that way, because really, Japan was at several points, at several points they were ready to come off the zero bound, but then something else happened. They had the Asian currency crisis, they had a recession in the early 2000s, they had that big crisis in the mid-2000s. So every time you kind of got around raising rates, and something else happened. So one way to interpret that is they're pegged at zero for 20 years. They didn't have any monetary policy that could mitigate the business cycle, and they just had to live with the shocks that went to the Japanese economy during that period. So maybe that's, I don't know if that's the future or not. Japan has been a good guide to what's been going on in Europe and the US over the last couple of years. On demographics, I do have a paper with Carlos Garriga and Chris Waller, where we did talk about demographics in Japan. It's a overlapping generation story. Older people prefer lower inflation. It's a political economic story. And so that we can get aging populations, they tend to want lower inflation. So that's one way to think about what's happening actually across the Western world, across the G7.
Okay, I think that's all right. Let's thank you.
Great, thank you.
I just want to mention a couple other people. One of the sponsors of this was INEX, and Roger Guéry helped sponsor the conference, and he unfortunately couldn't be here, but we're really grateful to him to mention that. And then, in addition to the two Bruces, who were always great at organizing things, we also have Terry Rowe on site, who has been terrific at just making things take over. So I think since she's here, it's